Hi, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Courageous Conversations about Our Schools. I'm your host, Ken Futernick, and today I have two very special guests who will be talking about a fascinating set of dynamics that often hold school systems back and ultimately prevent students from thriving. Both of them have spent decades studying and dealing with a deceptively simple question. Why do good people stay silent when they see problems that need to be addressed? Amy Edmondson is professor of leadership and management at the Harwood Business School. She's literally transformed the way organizations think about the absence of psychological safety and how that contributes to the problem of silence. You can learn more about her perspectives on that subject in her best-selling book, The Fearless Organization: Creating Psychological Safety in the Workplace for Learning, Innovation, and Growth. Welcome, Amy.
Glad to be here.
My other guest is Rich Harwood, who spent more than 35 years helping struggling communities work across divides. In his latest book, The New Civic Path, he urges community leaders, school leaders, education leaders to get out of their silos and to turn outward. Together, they have a great deal to teach us about what's happening in schools today. Rich, welcome back to the podcast.
Good to be with you, Ken, and with you, Amy.
So, Amy and Rich, we often think of unhealthy conflict as shouting matches and political polarization, culture wars. These things, of course, get a lot of attention in the media, but there's another problem I've become increasingly interested in as an educator, now as a school board member myself. Sometimes schools, and by extension students, fail to improve, not because there's too much conflict, but because there's too little. People stay quiet when speaking up might ultimately help students. I myself wrote about this recently in an article I called The Civility Trap. The absence of healthy conflict, I argued, comes from the sense of complacency that occurs when we place a higher premium on being polite and civil than on calling out and solving problems. Amy, let's start with you. Tell our listeners a little bit about you, your research, and what you've learned about people and organizations who are reluctant to speak up.
Well, I think I've learned something we all already knew, and certainly every one of us have experienced at work, which is that it is far easier to hold back than to speak up when the content, when one is not confident that the content of what you will say will be well received. And so anything from offering a dissenting view to critiquing a plan to asking for help to admitting a mistake, all of those are important inputs that could really help a decision get made better. But for so they will help the collective, but for the individual, it's always going to be far easier. Doesn't mean not that'll always happen, but it's always easier to hold back when you're not sure. For the things you're absolutely sure, they'll be well received. Sure, no problem. But for the things, and that's an awful lot of territory in an uncertain, complex world, right? For the things that we're not sure that they will be well received, it's just simpler, more natural to hold back. Again, not a very groundbreaking insight, but the implications of that insight, which I think we can all recognize as true, are huge, right? Whether it's for the quality of education, the safe care of patients, innovation, you name it. So that's kind of what I've been studying for more years than makes sense.
And I would love for you to give an example, but let me offer you one that I've experienced myself as a school board member. I recently offered some suggestions about how we in our county might do things differently, and thinking it was what I thought was a good suggestion, but it was met with skepticism and a little bit of why are you speaking up? And what I realized afterwards was that my suggestion was sort of an implicit criticism of what was going on. And I just innocently thought, I think there's a better way to do this. And what I didn't realize till later was that in just bringing something up that I thought would work better for students, suggested, implied that the people in the room, the administrators in the room who are responsible for those kinds of things would take it as, oh, you think we're not doing it the right way.
Yeah, I mean, that's actually a beautiful example, especially because you are coming, I guess roughly in from the outside, but you're coming with the generous intent to be helpful. And, or if you think that's too strong, just intent to be helpful. And you fail to recognize that it might not be well received and it might be heard as an implicit criticism. And so what you're basically illustrating with that story is you believed there to be psychological safety to openly speak up in pursuit of the goal. And then you discovered that, oops, maybe not. Maybe that wasn't the sort of the rules of the game here. And I would say that more often than your story, what happens is people understand, they immediately intuit that this good idea they have or this concern they have will be heard as a criticism, and that other people, especially higher ups, don't like criticism, which is true. We're human. So, too often, even your story of uttering something and having it fall flat doesn't even happen because people are erring on the side of holding back.
Yeah, and I left feeling, I mean, ultimately my suggestion, I kept talking with people and working through it. And over time, they sort of came around and said, this is actually a good idea. And just 2 days ago, we had a board meeting and I introduced a resolution to address the thing. And it was finally, ultimately received, but it took a lot of work to get people on board. Well, we're going to come back to you in a minute, of course. It's a wonderful segue into the work that Rich Harwood has done. And Rich, I want you to say a bit about yourself, what you've learned working from struggling communities across America. And I do recall you telling me that in Reading, Pennsylvania, a city deemed the poorest in the country several years ago, in a city whose school system was struggling, that there weren't any culture wars going on at the time during the pandemic, at a time when culture wars were emerging all over the country. And yet there were these problems and people weren't necessarily speaking up. And one of the things I recall, and people can listen to this podcast on our website about Reading that we did with you, that when you revealed or shared some data about what was going on, initially there was some defensiveness. People didn't want to accept what you had found, or they wanted to point fingers a little bit to other people. But Rich, anyway, welcome, and tell people a little bit about yourself and then your perspectives on this interesting question.
Yeah, good to be with you both. Yeah, let me just jump in on and build on what Amy was saying. I think, so I've been working now for almost 40 years on how to restore a sense of belief in ourselves and in one another and in this country that we can actually get things done together. Not as Republicans, Democrats, and independents, but as Americans, as people. And that's both within communities, it's across the country, and it's within, like with Amy, it's within organizations because they're often the engines of this change. A couple of things about the conversation you just had with Amy. One of the things, just to build on that, one of the things that I keep noticing is that there is an implicit frame that we have all embraced that we need to shift. This was true in Reading. It's true in a place like Jackson, Mississippi. It's true in places all across the country, and it's true on school boards. And it goes something like this. We have convinced ourselves that we are getting together to get along. What we need to focus on is that we're here not to get along, but to work together. And when that frame shifts, people feel it's just a reorientation. It doesn't change behavior set, but I think the orientation about getting along versus working together is really critical. We place a premium on getting along right now. This goes to your article about civility, right? We believe that, we should just sort of go along, get along, be polite to one another. But, as I often say in communities, if your child goes to an adequate public school and they go to a school board meeting or some other meeting and they get angry about something, they're frustrated about it, they may even be enraged about it. And we say to them, well, could you just calm down and be civil? That is code word for not expressing yourself. It's code word for denying people their reality. And when you deny people their reality, you deny their dignity. And then the game is over. The game is over. So, I think we've got to shift the frame of reference about the purpose of why we are together. That's what happened in Reading. When the purpose shifted, not that we are here to get along, not that we are here to be defensive, but that there's something the community is saying that we're trying to move our community forward. We created a 9-point education agenda. And what I had to keep saying to the school superintendent and to the school board and to other leaders is this isn't a report card on public schools. This is an agenda for the community to move forward that public schools is a part of. It's not the whole. So that was one part, Ken. We need to shift the frame of reference from getting along to working together. We need to shift the frame of reference from this being about the community, not about schools on their own. And then third, which I think is really important in all of this, is if we simply believe we're going to flip a switch and people are going to shift their behaviors and the norms by which they work together, then we're sorely mistaken and we're setting ourselves up for failure. What the school district needed to see from us over time was that we were going to live by our word, that we were not going to point fingers at the school district. We were trying to activate the community. They needed to see over time that we were actually with the community going to produce good things that had value to kids and others in the community in terms of moving forward. Third, they needed to see over time that there was a place for them and that we weren't going to put all these problems back at the schoolhouse door, that these were owned by the community and the school district could help us work on them, but we weren't going to ask them to solve them on their own. That track record, that consistency, that level of intentionality and discipline needed to be created in order for people to begin to change how they engage with one another.
I remember one of the examples of that in Reading, Rich, was that there was a desire among the community folks that you spoke to that we need safe places for our kids to be after school. And at the time, they were having to, if they did go to a place after school, it wasn't near where they lived.
Yeah.
And you said, well, we need to create spaces there. And the school says, we can't do that. We don't. And you said, it's a community problem, and people rose up and said, we can help. We can be part of that.
Right. So the change that began for school systems, I think, when I've worked with school systems, it's very seldom that I've seen transformational change begin within the district itself. It typically begins outside the community school, seeps into the school, begins to change the norms and behaviors, and then there's a fundamentally different relationship that's struck between schools and communities. So in the case of after school and out of school activities, we could have gone to the schools and said, this is your problem. You've got kids from 8 to 3:30 or whatever it might be. You need to deal with them once they're released from school. Instead, what the team in Reading said was, let's begin to create the change outside of the school. Let's begin to engage kids outside of the school. Let's realign all our after-school programs that are provided by nonprofits and churches and other providers. Then and only then did they go to the schools and say, one of the things that we learned is that your space inside the school is the most trusted space in the community. You have an asset. You have value. We cherish you. And we want to work with you to help provide the after-school programs that kids and families need in this community. Then the school district said, oh, you've changed the terms of the discussion and the terms of the relationship.
Yeah, and the asset is not being used otherwise.
That's right.
Yeah. So, Amy, you've heard Rich talk a little bit about what has enabled him and his work to get out of this dysfunctional cycle where people stay in their silos and don't speak up. I'm curious to know, what do you think about what Rich said, and then what have you learned about what it takes to get for people and organizations to get out of this dysfunctional cycle?
I'm gobsmacked by that insight of getting along as the implicit goal. And I think it's implicit, and actually it's in recent years, months, it's become explicit. And versus move the community forward, or in my terms, move the organization forward, make progress toward the mission. And I think that's just a very profound insight. I think there are far more times than we recognize where that implicit goal of going along, I mean, it's the civility trap, right? It's the sort of job one is to be polite, to look good, to be, to not rock the boat and all of that, as we were describing. And job two, a distant second, is to move the organization along. Guess what? Job two never really gets done for that very reason. So I think it's a kind of a profoundly insightful observation that applies across industries or industry contexts. And certainly one that I've seen in which is why I was so excited by your piece when I read it last night, Ken. But I think that where I've seen, and that's the norm in organizations, people think, oh, the private sector, they're just all so efficient and so, sort of like, capitalism works. Well, it's the same. There are human beings in there too who are inadvertently privileging getting along, looking good over the real mission and what it would take. And when we see exceptions, when we see sort of shining stars, the short answer is there's leadership there. But what does that really mean? Well, it means, one or more people who have recognized the opportunity to harness the efforts of others to achieve something really great. Right. And recognize with humility that that's not an easy thing to do. And that's when Rich describes Reading and other stories, I hear harnessing the community to team up and just make a little dent in it. And can I say more about what that kind of leadership looks like? I certainly can.
I think you mentioned the word humility. I think that's probably an important bit of advice for leaders, is to be humble enough to say, I don't know, I need more information, or I need your help, which then creates an opportunity for people to speak up and say, because what you're saying when you're humble is that I'm open to suggestions. We can do better.
Exactly.
You know?
Yeah. And how stupid do you have to be not open to suggestions, right? I mean, that's nutty in a, volatile, uncertain, complex, ambiguous world. If you're not open to suggestions, you're really not paying attention.
Amy, can you think of in all your work with organizations, examples of a place that was stuck because of these dynamics we're talking about, and then something happened that changed the dynamics, where, like in Reading, where people started feeling a little bit less fearful and started speaking up, and it moved the organization forward?
Yes. And the first example that comes to mind, and really the most prominent example that comes to mind, is not my own firsthand fieldwork, but it is the remarkable book called American Icon about Ford Motor Company and its transformation from about 2006 to 2016 under the leadership of an outsider who came in from Boeing named Alan Mulally. And the sentence you just said in that question described it precisely. People absolutely stuck, absolutely unwilling to tell the truth, despite the fact that Ford was in 2006 on track to lose, red ink, $16 billion. So, like, if that's supposed to be the motivating factor that changes behavior, it doesn't, right? What the motivating factor that changes behavior is that a leader or leaders come in and say, we can do this, but it's going to take us behaving in some very different ways. And by the way, feel no pressure to follow my order. You don't have to behave this way. But if you don't want to, the door is over there, right? So it's a kind of tough, but embracing, engaging stance. There is a way in which if we roll up our sleeves and work together, we can solve the problems that are leading to all of that failure. And we can turn this thing around and succeed again. I can see it. I know it's doable. I can't do it alone. I need your help. And this is what it's going to look like. And it's going to be straight honesty, transparency, teamwork. It's not rocket science, but it's rare as ghosts.
Rich, jump in, please.
Yeah, no, just to build on it, again, it sort of reminds me of, I've never seen a community or an organization or an individual for that matter move forward if they're focused on either the problems, a laundry list of problems, because that just sort of locks them in to simply trying to find their way out.
Firefighting.
Exactly. Right. Which sort of furthers this sort of get along, getting together versus working together, or creating utopian visions, which are unattainable and by definition are often not relevant to people moving forward tomorrow, the next day, the day after that, right? They're too far out and they're unattainable, and people often don't have the resources. The shift, again, this is a reorientation, but then it gets backed up by behaviors and systems. The reorientation is shifting from problems in communities or utopian visions to one of shared aspirations. And it sort of echoes things that Amy was getting at, which is when people can articulate their shared aspirations, they're usually things from their gut that are actionable, doable, and achievable. And when we articulate them in a shared way with others, so now we're not just getting together, we're working together, it immediately implicates us in saying, A, we share these, not all of them, but enough that we can move forward. And B, we're implicated that we are needed. All of us are needed. No one leader, no one group, no one department can achieve these on their own. We need to go together. And then if you build on that and say, so what are the challenges standing before us in achieving our aspirations? Right, connected to our aspirations, what I find most times, even within organizations, is that they're typically not attached to financial things. They're attached to how we work together. They're attached to whether or not we have the right culture. They're attached to whether we have the right norms. They're attached to whether people are stepping forward and leading and having hard conversations. And then if you talk about, so what needs to change in order for us to move forward, again, people tend to focus on things that are non-financial. Not always, but by far most times. They're actionable and they're doable. That's what unleashes people's desire. Because what I heard in Amy's comment was, how do we unleash and harness people's desire to work together to achieve something beyond where we are? Right? That to me is the trick here. And we keep getting locked into these alternative ways of doing things, just getting together, where we just talk, go through agendas, tick off the tasks we're supposed to do, but they're not adding up to real change and real achievements and getting to the place we really want to go to. That's what needs to shift. And what I find over and over again in communities is that if we don't make this initial shift, all the strategies, programs, and initiatives don't go anywhere because they're operating still in the old system, the old orientation, and we've got to get out of that.
How do you make that shift? I mean, how do you install the reorientation, if you will?
It's really interesting. You've said a number of times, it's not rocket science. I subscribe.
It's harder, right?
I subscribe to the school of Amy, so it's not rocket science. But it does require, as you know, intentionality and discipline. and some rigor, which is what we say to folks is, first of all, we say to folks, what's the difference between being turned inward and being turned outward? This works within organizations too. And people can name that difference pretty quickly. And when they look at it and you say, so which side do you tend to live on? Not all the time, but tend to live on. That's one orientation. That loosens up people because they realize that the only way that they can achieve what they're after is to be turned outward. They have to have some reference point, the community, people, their organization's larger purpose in mind. Second, it's moving people from problems and utopian visions to shared aspirations. So it's basically asking, in the most rudimentary sense, what are our shared aspirations for this company, for this community, for our country? As you know, people can answer that. They can answer it. And as I said before, it's not pie in the sky stuff. It's things that are actionable, doable, and achievable. It's remarkable. And when people answer it together, they realize that they're in something together. So now they have to work together, not just get together to achieve these. And then you can actually have a conversation about, so what does it mean to work together to achieve these?
Let me just throw in an example in a school setting. This is from an interview I did a couple of years ago during the culture wars, when it was the beginning of stories we began to hear where teachers were saying, I just don't talk about those things anymore because they're too controversial. We don't approach history the same way because I'm fearful that parents are going to get upset. And this one teacher says, she's a middle school teacher, Tracy Barnett from Fremont, California, and she says, I continue to teach history honestly, and which means the good, the bad, and the ugly. Students need to know about that. And her principal's online too, and says, I completely support what Tracy's doing. And Fremont is a pretty conservative community in a very blue state. And the way she did it was she actually did what you said, Rich. She turned outward, and she had been doing it for years. Rather than telling her principal, just keep the teachers away, or parents away, and protect me, let me do my thing, and keep them out of my classroom. She said, I want to connect with parents. She invited parents in to come in and watch some of the movies, participate in discussions. At the beginning of the year, she'd send out the curriculum for the year. This is what we're doing and why. I welcome your questions. I want to listen to see. She developed trust by doing what you said, not going inward and closing her door and say, leave me to do what I'm trained to do. I'm going to reach out to my community. And her parents trusted her. And her principal stood up and said, by all means, I support what Tracy's doing. And it had really significant impact because it would allow her to continue teaching history the way I think it should be taught.
But she showed really impressive leadership capabilities, which are not widely taught and not widely available. And it's a great story. And it leaves me ever so slightly heartbroken that not every history teacher has that skill set. I mean, they should, but they don't. And therefore, we have these kind of, rather stupid debates about whether or not we should teach history, truthfully. Like that just seems like a stupid debate. But wow, good for her. That's leadership. Yeah. But it's leadership of the Ken variety that's really, engaging people in jointly solving and sharing that aspiration.
What I found is that some of this is kind of counterintuitive. When we get stressed and we're fearful, we often turn inward. We close the doors, protect us. And what Tracy did and her principal supported was, no, I want to do the opposite of what some
might do. Yeah.
Some might do, which is, I want to, but she actually had been doing it, and she just continued doing it because it had been successful in the past.
Right.
I want to share with both of you, I want to test out a hypothesis about another facet to this silence problem that I think is a little bit different, but it is endemic in school systems, especially ones that are struggling. So, by way of a story, let me test out this hypothesis and see what you think. A number of years ago, I headed up a school turnaround center for an organization called WestEd, a national organization that does great work in schools. And I was working in an urban high school in Los Angeles, and one of my colleagues started doing some professional development work with a whole bunch of math teachers. And students in this school were struggling with math, and he had been in and observed a number of math teachers and thought, because of his background teaching math himself, I want to offer something. So he did. He went in, and after a few weeks doing it every week, I asked him, how is it going? He said, it's going pretty well. He said, I've got this one guy, he's been at the school for 15 years. He has not said a single word the entire time I've been there. Another 2 weeks, he says, I get the sense that the guy just doesn't care. He's given up on kids. A couple of weeks later, it comes back to me. He says, an amazing thing happened. He raised his hand and he said, you've probably been wondering why I've been silent the entire time you've been here. And he said, I was curious about that because you haven't been engaged at all. He said, over the past, I've been here many years. He said, year after year, we get a new principal. Year after year, we get a new curriculum. We get people like you coming in and saying, I've got the greatest pedagogy to share with you that's going to be amazingly successful. He said, I have not spoken up because I don't want to start down the path and start trying to do things differently, only to discover that yet once again, you're out of here, or we've got a new principal. So he said, but I like what you're saying. I think I can do better. And I'm willing to engage starting today if you can promise me you're going to stick around. So it had nothing to do. It wasn't that he didn't care. It wasn't so much fear as much as it was exasperation. And I have encountered so many principals, and even some of my community now, they come in, they're enthusiastic, and they wonder why when they ask for volunteers to do something, they just are met, no one wants to volunteer, no one wants to be part of it. And of course, some of them throw their hands up and say, I've got a staff that doesn't care. But I think my hypothesis is that it's something else. But I'm curious to know what you think about this teacher's response, or his, what he ended up telling my colleague. Rich, what are your thoughts about that story?
Well, two things immediately come to mind. It happens in communities every day, which is these initiatives get created with great fanfare and with enormous promises that we know we can't keep and we ought never to make, that we do it every day. And these things do come and go. Foundations, funders are guilty of funding these fads every 2-3 years and putting grant cycles on things where we know it's going to take 10 years to create the transformational change that the community needs and is looking for. And they say it's got to happen in 18 months. So we impose solutions that are developed outside, and we believe that we can just use a plug and play approach, even though it doesn't fit the context. The community doesn't have the civic culture to support it. It may not even be wanted, and it gets rejected over time. So one part of the challenge here is that the leadership that is promoting certain change is wreaking havoc on our organizations and on communities and on people. The second part of this is, why do we wonder why people don't believe that this is for real? The very first comment I get in communities, including Reading, including from the funder, one of the funders who funded us in Reading, is I remember sitting around a table talking to the potential funders, and one of them looked at me and she said, Rich, why is this initiative going to be any different than all the other civic initiatives that have come and gone and created frustration, skepticism, and cynicism in our community? And my reaction to her was, Karen, I can't guarantee that this is going to be different simply by sitting here. What I can do is I can show you that it's going to be different over time. And so I think the example of the math teacher who did care. I meet very few people in communities and organizations who don't care. Everyone cares about whether or not kids are learning math. Everyone cares about the kids sitting in their classroom, whether or not they're going to thrive or not. Everyone cares whether or not those kids are going to have a future. No one would go into teaching if they didn't care. Of course, that math teacher cared. But we shouldn't be surprised that there's a deep sense of disbelief. And this math teacher was expressing, from my point of view, a sense of disbelief. Why should I believe you? Why should I believe that this is going to be any different? Why should I believe that you're going to stick with us? Why should I believe, going back to what we were saying earlier, why should I believe that I should participate in this conversation to work together as opposed to just getting together? What changed for that math teacher was that someone began to create a track record. Someone began to demonstrate that something really was going to be different. Someone demonstrated that we could do this together. All the things that happened in Reading and happened in communities that we're working with all across 50 states. But we have to, last point about this, if we want more people to engage, and I'll just tee this up maybe for a different part of the conversation, then I think we also have to rethink our notion of how change happens, how it gets catalyzed, how it unfolds over time, how people come to it in their own time over time. We can't dictate when they're going to come to it.
And just one quick comment, then I want to hear your thoughts, Amy. You talked about, things aren't going to change overnight. I think the reason he spoke up was the guy had been coming back week after week after week,
right.
And the guy said, "You're putting up with people like me that aren't saying anything.
Yeah.
You must care. You're willing to stick
That's
with
right.
us
That's
for
right.
the long term."
I say to people in communities, the burden is on you. If you're seeking to engage people in this community, the burden is on you, not the person you're trying to engage. Yes, there is a burden on them eventually, a responsibility. But people have been sold so many false bills of goods of bill. So many people have been honestly screwed in this country. If you live in West Virginia or coal country, we have made all sorts of promises to you about transition support that we haven't followed through on. So if we're working in a place like West Virginia or in Alamance County, which is one of the most divided places I've worked with in America, or Jackson, Mississippi, who has been consistently left out and left behind by the state of Mississippi and others, then the burden's on those who are trying to catalyze change to go back time and again and again and again until you demonstrate to people that you do care, you are listening, you do value them, and that you're willing to go at their pace. And this is particularly true for communities that have experienced trauma. We cannot dictate and we cannot set timelines for a human condition where people have experienced a lack of belief, cynicism, frustration. We've got to keep showing up and demonstrating that we're going to do business differently.
Amy, I'd love to hear your thoughts about what Rich said and about the math teacher who was silent for a really long time.
So many thoughts, and it's a wonderful story. It's a story of change, right? I mean, it's a classic phenomenon in a change story, and so that's what makes it really important, rather than just a idiosyncratic kind of story. But while you were telling the story, I was thinking about Ken's description of response to my question: how do you reorient? How do you get people to sort of shift the orientation, which to me seems so very important? And his answer, gave us an answer, inward, outward, but his answer was really, I lead with inquiry, right? I ask them questions, ask them questions so that they will see on their own what they want, which they already want. We know they want, right? So that inquiry. So now let's go to the silence problem in the math teacher story. In my framework, which is not all that dissimilar not at all dissimilar, but maybe not as skillful as Ken's. The the guy coming in, who is dedicated and wonderful, missed three things. One, he did not set the stage, right? He sort of came in with his content. He said, it's great, you're going to love it. But he didn't set the stage by calling attention to that context, calling attention to that history of, I know I'm probably the 47th person who's come through here. And yet I'm going to ask you to give me a chance because I have some ideas that I think are going to help you, but you're going to have to be the one who tell me, well, whatever, you set the stage to say, this is new territory. I'm willing to name the elephant in the room. And then as quickly and early as possible, I'm going to make sure I'm answering the question, what's in it for me, but not just like this is a great mousetrap, but I'm going to ask you, like, what are your biggest struggles in the math class? And I'm going to listen deeply. And then I'm going to say, well, here, there's a way in which this might help, right? Or that might help. So making it more of a, what did you say, solving problems together, working together rather than getting along. Because in a way, the silent guy was doing a very good job of getting along. He wasn't making trouble. He wasn't, being disruptive in the classroom, but he was folding his arms and, I'll wait and see. That's what everybody everywhere in every change journey does. And so we probably could have gotten there faster had the interventionist been someone who really sort of understood that I'm walking into a history, and I've got to lead with inquiry. I've got to sort of say how I see it, but then I've got to get you to fill in my gaps, and then we're going to work together.
Mm.
Yeah, one of the things that we often say is part of this, and I think Amy, you just did a really wonderful job at describing this, is we have to make entreaties to people. And entreaties are different than invitations. Invitation is come join my party.
Right.
Just bring a dish.
Right.
An entreaty is let's go together and let's create something together. And I do agree with Amy, this happens when we keep going to communities, which is starting with their context. And as Amy said, one of the first things I always have to say is, I know people have come and gone here and be different. But I do think that this is in part, I think too often when these efforts are begun, people try to sell their solution as opposed to saying, I have some ideas about this. I've seen different parts work before. We have to create it for here, for how it's going to work here. Do you want to go together and be partners in that, to be builders together, to be creators together, maybe to be recreators together, which is what the country needs. And I think, again, one of the things, Amy, you said early on is that, we don't develop leaders in these ways, right? So many of the things that I find in communities and in organizations when we're working with them is we've got to, in a sense, ask them to develop a different set of assumptions about how things work. We need to help them develop a reorientation about what it means to make them work, right? Because so many of the things that they believe happens actually don't happen that way when you actually examine them.
That's right.
And they have to step forward in a very different way. We've talked about humility. We've talked a little about courage. Obviously, they're different sides of the same coin. And people often don't pair them together. And they're desperately needed together in order for each to function well.
I love that. I mean, people don't understand, and not because they're, not smart, but because it's like none of us really understand how things are actually getting done. And there's this strong belief in the way we were taught they were getting done. Like in the business world, it's, there's a strong belief that there's a hierarchy and there are people at different levels with different specialties and responsibilities and deadlines and commitments. And they kind of tell other people what to do. And like at the end, here's a car, right? It actually doesn't work like that at all. Right? It's a bunch of swirling activity that's very,
very dynamic.
very dynamic and very fluid, meaning the
Yeah,
porous and complex and um, full of problem solving and working things out. And then there's a car.
right, exactly. Which raises a different, a related point, which is the fluidity that you're talking about and the dynamics that you're just describing. So many of the spaces within organizations and communities, obviously, clearly, are not amenable to fluidity. They're not
Mm.
amenable to examining dynamics. They're not amenable to really examining what are we learning, not what are we
Yeah.
planning, what are our budgets, what are our tasks. Like we've created spaces called innovation spaces that you're not allowed to talk about those things. They're off limits. We're only going to talk about what are we learning and what does it mean for us.
Hmm.
And
Hmm.
so what I find over and over again in organizations, in communities, other places, is that we've got to pry open fundamentally different types of spaces with different ground rules. Again, Amy, this is something you mentioned early on, driven by different norms, not just of getting together, but working together, but with a certain purpose. And those spaces tend to have been squeezed out in our desire for efficiency, specialization, mechanization, right? Speed, right? Meeting budgets. We've squeezed all these spaces out. This is one of the problems with school boards. I think we've squeezed out the space for this kind of examination that isn't just pie in the sky, it's filled with purpose so that we can actually achieve something
Mm.
together.
Right. We've squeezed out the exploratory mode,
Yeah,
right? And the exploratory mode has never been more necessary
yeah,
because things are changing so fast.
right.
Including the dreaded AI conversation, but they're changing so fast. Like if we're not carving out enough time for exploring, experimenting, testing, conversing about possibilities and how we'll figure out what ones work, we really will be left behind.
Yeah, absolutely. And in that space, when we're developing catalytic leaders, we keep making a distinction for them between, and Ken, this goes all the way back to where we began. Uh, the distinction between this is a basic distinction, right? Criticism and critique. And criticism obviously doesn't get us anywhere. It tends to devolve into negativity and feeling trapped, and everyone
Mm,
takes it personally. Critique is filled with tension. Good critique is filled with tension. It's filled with possibility. It's filled with, I'm offering you this critique because I want us to improve so that together we can get someplace.
yeah.
And I think in this exploratory space, Amy, that you're mentioning, and in other spaces, I'm not sure we've done a strong enough job at helping people learn the difference between criticism and critique and the norms by which critique actually occurs and how you need to bring yourself into those spaces and essentially make a deal with others, an agreement, a covenant that we're in this together, we're working together, and therefore critique for all of us is really critical and essential.
Right.
I'm wondering if part of the problem here is this notion that to be a good leader means you have to be an expert. And so if you're an expert, then you're expected to have the answers. And so if you say, we're going to do this together and explore, what does that say about me? Don't you know the answer? And actually, I think a courageous and an effective leader might say, I don't, but we can figure it out. But it's hard because you're getting paid the big bucks. You have this authority, and yet you're saying we need to do this together. Why don't you just tell us what we're supposed to do? Of course, I don't really want you to do that to me, but there is that dynamic, I think, of this conflation of being an expert and being a good leader, which I don't think necessarily works very well.
Yeah, and you can be an expert and be a good leader, but you
Mm,
don't need to be an expert to be a good leader.
mm,
And it can get in your way, right? And that is because, I mean, first of all, it's an old, outmoded idea of what leadership is that leaders have the answers. I mean, if anything, they have the questions, and they do at times have responsibility to set direction and engage people in the way you're describing, Ken. But answers, God no. And I mean, think about how much expertise and knowledge there is. I mean, I don't know, 120 years ago, anyway, I can say with confidence, there were two specialties in medicine and surgery. Now there are 89. And so an expert, by definition, is someone who's quite deep and quite narrow. And what organizational or community problem can be solved by someone quite deep and quite narrow? Not much.
So with that, I want to, before we start heading towards closing this wonderful discussion up, I want to pose a question to you, Amy, because you're in higher ed, and Rich, you're certainly welcome to weigh in on this, but I wonder what role you think fear plays in higher ed classrooms. It's a bunch of evidence that's emerging that more and more
Does
students.
this begin the second hour of this
I
podcast?
know.
Yeah.
I
This
know.
is going to
Really,
be.
how much time do you have? Yeah.
But there was an article in Edweek recently by a guy named David Bob, and the title of it was "America at 250. Our classrooms are too quiet." And what he said was that more and more they're finding that students, and I think this is true in high schools and at the higher ed level, are reluctant to speak up because of fear of what people will think about them and what they might say, that they might be canceled. And I'm wondering, Amy, are you seeing that at Harvard? Are you getting a sense of that? And what are your thoughts
Yeah.
about that? And what can we do? What must we do to prevent students of all places where they should be voicing their opinion, testing out their ideas? How do
Right.
we counter this trend towards silence?
All right. I'll do my best, but the short answer is yes, we see it. We see it a lot. And I think it is that age-old human worry about what these other, high status peers think of me, and that will, and the older you get, I teach in a graduate school, not in an undergraduate school, the more you start to have the belief that these are among the people that I may be interacting with who may in part determine aspects of my future. So there is this kind of very real worry that how they think of me will matter. Again, we could have another hour on this, but then there's this secondary layer that's new-ish, last 15 years, that anything I say or do might live forever on the internet. And that is, you catch me in a moment of time taking a divergent point of view for the purpose of debate or because I really feel it or whatever, but now it's going to be the thing that cancels me not only in this room but everywhere. And so this is hard to fix. And I think the answer is some combination of the type of inquiry oriented engagement of the participants, the students in the learning mission here. That I can't as a professor produce their learning. We have to co-produce it. But and we could go on and it would be a little bit of an echo from what we've been talking about. But the other is, I think we have to get very strict, and we do this well, about electronics in the classroom. The answer is just no, right? Because if there's even a prayer of there being something like a safe learning environment, and I don't mean safe like you won't feel triggered, I mean safe like you can express a completely wrong view or answer, and it will be a useful element of the dialogue, right? That we learn. So there's that sort of simpler, if not easy, answer of we at least if we can try to take away the electronic part of this problem, we'll be partway there. But we still are going to have to co-produce the other bit by working together.
I want to thank you for that. I think one of the things that teachers and professors need to do too is to, when you hear inappropriate response, either through body language or verbally, to some unpopular view, you have to call it out. Say,
Absolutely. No,
this
name
is,
it. Name it.
name
And
it.
not to
This
shame
is,
it, but to sort of say, to call its impact, to name its impact.
yeah. There was a guy I interviewed named Bruce Wasser who was a conscientious objector back in the Vietnam War, and he was going to go off and become an attorney. And then he decided he would become a high school history teacher. But he talks about how hard it was for him to speak up at a time when being a conscientious objector was not popular. So he really has great respect for the idea that and the courage it takes to speak up. So in his history class, he would often pose questions that people would have different views about, and sometimes unpopular views. And when people expressed an unpopular view, he said, I would go stand next to them, put my hand on their back, and let them know that I supported them, and I wanted others in the room to support their efforts to try to express a point of view that might be unpopular.
Good
So
for
he was
him.
very
Yeah. So
deliberate.
he was modeling the behavior.
Yeah. And would not tolerate, I mean, people could disagree. He wanted that. But he
Right.
didn't want them to treat people with contempt or to bully them or to dismiss them, to treat them without a sense of dignity. And I
Right.
don't think there's anything more important that teachers and professors can do than to promote that idea.
I agree. And it's not always easy real time.
So I think with that, I'm going to thank both of you for being part of a really fascinating conversation. It's so interesting to me that our focus on this podcast and in the media is on responding to conflict and unhealthy conflict in culture wars. And yet what we've been talking about for the last hour or so is the flip side of the coin, which is the absence of conflict, the tendency for us to be silent and to not deal with the elephants in the room or the problems that are really wreaking havoc on communities and people and so forth. So with that, I want to thank you for a fascinating discussion. For those listening, you can find this and all of our episodes of Courageous Conversations about our schools at schoolconversations.org. You will also find some additional resources there about Amy's work and Rich's work. And you can also listen to this podcast episode and all of the rest of them wherever you get your podcasts. So long, everybody.